We began with two images, two photographs of images. The photographs occur in this book called Angels of Pompeii, with photographs by Stephen Rigidi and poetry by Robert Bly, recently published by Ballantine Books, New York. Pompeii, we've mentioned a week ago or so, was buried by volcanic ash in 70 AD, the very same year that Jerusalem was decimated. So that Pompeii is preserved exactly at one of the most arcane moments in world history. And in Pompeii we have exactly preserved there the reality of an entire city, an entire Roman city, at the apex of a power crisis in the first century of the Common Era. These two angels are from a villa where the frescoes in this room, one room of this one villa, are the only evidence that we have of the mystery cult that was the mysterious core of the religious experience of people in the Roman world at the crisis of power in 70 AD, 70 CE, at that time. What is extraordinarily important, but easy for us to miss, is that at the articulation of the parts of the ceremonies, where the bones of the rituals come together in movable joints of articulation, there are two aspects that come together and almost touch but do not. One of the aspects are angels, and the other aspects are initiates. So that to sum it up in a phrase, the mystery cults of the ancient world had something to do with an interface between angels and initiates. Now, what is peculiar about this is that when we take a look at these images, these frescoes, we see that the scenes are articulated in such a way that the initiate's reception is the episodic punctuation of the stages of what's going on. If an initiate does not receive what has been given already, then there's no end to that stage and no beginning of a new stage. So that our capacity to receive is the only guarantee that something new can happen. And it's only our ongoing ability to receive that allows for the process to move to completion. It's very simple, very complex. It's the way reality works. Without yin, the yang can't do any more than just be what it is initially. Only when it is received is a new second movement possible. In this little book called Women's Dionysian Initiation, subentitled The Villa of Mysteries in Pompeii, by a very elegant woman who was a Swiss Union analyst, Linda Fierez David. She writes here in her description of the first scene, the initiate is depicted in this first scene as just having set foot in the chamber. In other words, here is a space a chamber in this fresco. And the first stage is that one has set foot, one has begun to enter that space. The entrance to the chamber was the first stage, the very first stage. But there is a very special comportment that is shown. Yes, the foot is shown just entering, almost like a William Blake type of an illustration where the position of the feet give the indication of the direction of what's happening and give us the tone of the significance, whether it's the left foot or the right foot. In this case, having just set foot in the chamber, the initiate, who is a woman, she stands motionless, and in her motionlessness listens to a naked boy who reads with an anxious expression on his face, reads from a scroll. And as the naked boy is reading from the scroll, behind him is another woman, a priestess, who guides and protects him as he reads. Let's put it into an iconographical line. Here is a woman who is entering in. She is an initiate. Here is a woman who occupies that sacred space already. She is the priestess. She is the embodiment of an angelic direction, presence in the priestess, in her body, in her person. In between the woman initiate and the woman angel priestess is a naked boy who is reading. Under guidance and protection by the angelic woman, to the initiate woman who is coming in, who instantly, when she comes in, is motionless. So that the first stage of initiation in the mysteries was that as soon as you enter, you have to stop entering. It sounds so simple as to be almost stupid. It is profound. You have to enter in such a way that the entrance is done only once. One step. If you were to continue and make more steps, it would create a diffusion of the entry step. And instead of the first stage being pristine, the first stage would have to average out all the steps that you had taken and would not only dilute itself, but would create a false first stage, which was an average. Because the law of entropy is so in place in this universe that no matter what happens, multiplicity always, by the second law of thermodynamics, multiplicity always averages itself out. Whether it's number of steps that someone takes, whether it's number of gas molecules in a given area, whether it's the number of atoms or ions, the real truth of reality is that when there is a multiplicity, the form takes an average of the multiplicity and conveys that as its reality. Whereas in the mysteries, when we have to really know what is true, pristinely, not on an average, but what is actually now true, one step and one step only. So that the initial stage of initiation in the mysteries was to recognize that one could take and has taken only one step, the entrance. The second stage is indicated here. The transition to the second scene is made by the figure of the initiate adorned with a crown of myrtle, who now goes further on her way. She seems still to be hearkening back to the teaching which she has just heard. She has let her cloak fall. Under it one sees a light sleeveless tunic. She carries a sliced artificial cake in a metal vessel in her left hand, and with her right hand she holds a small branch of laurel. Cake and a laurel. But while she takes the second step, she does not take the second step in the context of herself, but in the context of keeping in remembrance what she has heard read to her. The reading by the naked boy under the guidance and protection of the angelic priestess, those words have come out and have sealed the initiate woman in her first stage step, the singularity of her first stage step. Language has the power to seal because it can articulate, and the right sounds seal. And when that first stage is sealed for her, she can carry that first stage pristinely within herself by remembering the words and keeping the remembrance of the words alive in her, so that the second steps and third steps are quite distinct and yet are linked together. As long as she remembers the words, then, the second stage will be linked to the first by the words, but not confused and mulched nor averaged out. The simple way of conveying this was to have beads in a necklace, that each bead was separated from each other bead by a knot in the string. So that a primitive rosary, having nothing to do with any particular church or any particular religion, in the Greek culture today you have worry beads that perform the same function. There's no difference between the beads of a Buddhist priest and the worry beads of a Greek taxicab driver. It's the same ritual function, and we're talking about ritual. It articulates happening. It gives articulate, episodic structure to existence. Without that articulation, existence would overwhelm us. If existence occurred to us in its oneness, the oneness of existence is so enormous. Someone the other day was talking about the inappropriateness of young teenagers trying to commit suicide by driving their cars in front of trains. And they were making the analogy that it's a 200-ton train hits a pickup truck with the same impact that a pickup truck would hit a soda can. Existence is like a 20 billion year universe hitting one single individual. The obliteration would be colossally instant. And so existence must be articulated, and that's the purpose of ritual, to articulate existence. This is why all sentient beings, it doesn't matter what culture you're from, it doesn't matter what star system you're from, all sentient beings must select so that existence becomes articulated. And a ritual is that selective process. So the difference between ritual and nature is that nature is unselected, unedited, unified. The only thing that could be said about nature is like what we said almost 5 months ago. Nature can be characterized mathematically as a matrix of change with an infinite tensor capacity. There's no limit to the ratioed realities of nature. And all of that occurs seamlessly, without any articulation whatsoever. It is only our ritual comportment in existence that allows for us to have an experience which is articulate in a non-infinite way. Part of the trade-off that has to be recovered in this process, part of what we lose in this process, is an accurate understanding of the unity of nature. So that while ritual benefits us in allowing existence to be articulated so that we can live with it, we have lost the confidence in the unity of existence, in the unity of nature. And so ritual has to do two things. It has to articulate existence so we can stand it, so we can live it, so we can be in it, and not be totally upset, infinitely fast. But it also has to reassure us in a remembrance way that it still is the same unity. It hasn't suffered any loss whatsoever. And that while our existence is articulated and thus real, its reality is not a secondary reality to nature, that we're still a part of nature. So all ritual has this double aspect to it constantly, assuring us that existence is real because it's particular and articulated, and also that it is truly related back to nature in such a way that we could be reabsorbed into nature without leaving any trace of anything left over. We have not made, in our trade-off, such a fundamental error as to leave something which could not be reabsorbed back into the reality of nature. This in itself produces a further problem when existence becomes experience. Because experience then understands that, all right, on the ritual level, because of rituals, we've been articulated and yet still related to the unity of nature. But on the experience level, the polarity of the functions of ritual, affirming individuality, affirming universality, that polarity which has been resolved in ritual is carried over into experience unresolved, because the resolution in existence in ritual, that resolution does not carry over, does not automatically carry over. And so experience faces the same flaw, the same difficulty, so that myth faces the same problem that ritual faced, but on a higher order, in a different way. What's the difference? What's the comparison? Ritual deals with objectivity. It deals with something. It deals with masks. It deals with dance steps. It deals with whether you did or did not raise the cup. It deals with whether this is a purely made cake or whether it has false artificial ingredients. Ritual deals with an objective quality, whereas myth, language, deals with process, not with objectivity, but with the fluid process. And so myth, in an odd way, experience in an odd way, is a parallel to nature. It's a process flow rather than an object thing. Rather than artifacts, which in ritual there are all kinds of artifacts. There are knives, there are arrows, there are spears, there are masks, all kinds of artifacts. There are no artifacts per se in myth, in language. No artifacts per se. But because the problem of the difference in the polarity, individuality and universality, because that problem was there in ritual and solved in ritual, but the problem was carried over into myth. Myth seeks to solve the problem in the same way that it was solved initially in ritual. And so language tends to make images in language and to posit the images as artifacts, the images as objective things. But they are not truly objective things. They are still process and not objective. They're still subjective rather than objective. And this leads to another stage. It leads to the stage of symbols. Because symbols objectify what the images of language cannot. We say that such and such of an image stands for something else. That if I have an image of a flower, my image of this flower stands for that flower. Does it? Is my image of this flower in that vase? Hardly. So that the true way to speak about this, and I'm going to borrow a phrase from a great 20th century poet, T.S. Eliot. He struggled with these kinds of things a long time. He came up with an interesting phrase. He called it objective correlative. That a poetic image doesn't represent, doesn't represent. My image of the flower doesn't represent the flower, but it's a correlative to the objective flower. So that images correspond to things, but they in no way can specifically be said to represent them. We use the term representation rather sloppily. And usually we can use it sloppily. It doesn't make any difference. But on this fine level of trying to get square with the problems on level of existence and experience, we have to watch what we say. That American writer named Stanley Clavell wrote a beautiful little book, Must We Mean What We Say? And the answer is, if we would like to live in this life with other people and with ourselves, we must mean what we say, at least occasionally. If my image of that flower does not represent that flower, what does it do? It stands as a correlation to that flower. My image correlates to that flower. But because my image is not objective, it occurs in a process of language. The only way to objectify language is to transform the image into a participation with an objective, factual thing, like a symbol. And a symbol in mind is as objectively real as that flower in that vase. The symbolic and the ritual are two objective levels. They really happen. And they happen exactly to the same degree of reality. A symbol is quite real. Which is why occasionally in some of the more intense writings of Carl Jung, he will say to readers or to patients, we don't have archetypes, they have us. That's part of the problem. you're looking to wrestle with an angel like Jacob, you have to be really careful that you're not just grabbing your own self. There's something mystically accurate about being able to do that. Now these two angels from Pompeii that we showed, the first angel that we showed, the first angel coming down was carrying a cornucopia. A cornucopia. That's like this long ram's horn filled with fruit and vegetables. That cornucopia, the long ram's horn filled with fruits and vegetables, is a symbol of, in Greek mythology, of Demeter. The mother of Persephone. The woman who has lost her daughter to the underworld and wanders in search of her. And finally realizes that she cannot reclaim her daughter totally for this world, but she comes to an understanding that she has the power as a symbol in her symbolic capacity to bring life exactly equal to the underworld, which was understood as death. So that this world and the underworld, this world and the next world, can be brought into paired polarity by the power of symbols. Notice here that that one could say there's a redeeming or a salvific function to symbols. But that they do not do the complete job. They only create a paired polarity, the possibility of a resolution. That one needs to go further. That you can get even, you can get 50-50 with symbols, but you cannot take it one iota further than 50-50. The best that one can hope for is a paired polarity. But the odd thing is that in this universe, the phenomenon of a paired polarity of complete 50-50, exact 50-50, produces a horizon known as equanimity. Not standoff, but equanimity. That what happens in the reality of this universe is when a pair of two comes together in complete, perfect balance, there is a subtle, relentless, actual interchange between the two that comes unbidden. Why is this so? It is not only so esoterically in ancient mysteries, but it is true mathematically in nuclear physics and can be shown, it can be written out. Even not in nuclear physics, but in electromagnetic theory, because the first person to put it into mathematical form was Maxwell. James Clerk Maxwell, a century ago. And so it's known in circles of physics and higher mathematics as Maxwell's demon. Because, not demon because it's bad, but demon because it bugged mathematicians who were trying to hold on to their sanity by understanding that the Newtonian world, the Newtonian universe that had 3 laws of thermodynamics had to be true. There was no way that it could not be true. And the second law of thermodynamics is that there cannot be an exchange between two mathematically paired off polarities that have no meeting place whatsoever. They have no osmotic interface whatsoever, and yet it actually happens. And this was bugging them, and so they called it Maxwell's demon. And the best little explanation of this occurs in a book that just came out this week, called The Quark and the Jaguar, Adventures in the Simple and the Complex by Murray Gell-Mann, 1994. And here on page 222, we have a little page headlined Maxwell's Demon. And Murray Gell-Mann, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1969, was at Caltech for many years, head of the Santa Fe Institute now, tells us in trying to answer these questions of how do things really work in this universe, how do they really work? Let's look at them and see what actually happens. Not what we hope is happening, not what we fear is happening or not happening, not what we want to believe is happening or not happening, but actually what is happening. In trying to answer those questions, it is useful to discuss a hypothetical demon that spends its time sorting. All it does is sort. Namely Maxwell's demon, dreamt up by the same James Clerk Maxwell who found the equations for electromagnetism. And if you go to Caltech's bookstore, you can find in 2 Dover paperback volumes, The Theory of Electromagnetic by James Clerk Maxwell, and they're very hard to read even a century later. Very, very hard to read. And the fact that 100 years ago in Victorian England, Maxwell himself was almost choked and gagged because the equation showed mathematically that this universe is not only true positively, but is equally true negatively. Because the equations solved 2 ways, simultaneously, in complete symmetry, with no prejudice whatsoever. And it wasn't until the late 20th century that the Victorian blinders came off mathematicians to the extent to where they could see that the negative solution of James Clerk Maxwell's electromagnetic theory showed us that all kinds of negative and irrational numbers are real, equally real. It led to things like chaos theory and knot theory and many other developments. Here's what Murray Gell-Mann writes. Maxwell, in writing out these equations for electromagnetic theory, and we're talking about ritual, we're talking about the way existence really happens, because when we know how existence really happens, we then know why experience has certain universal problems that always come up. And it's not that they come up, but that they are there. And that part of the maturation of experience is finding that those damn problems, oh, there they are again, are there. How did they get there? They're not just fictional artifacts of bad living. Geez, you woke up today with bad thoughts and that's why you have them. It's not that at all. You're not guilty. And neither is he or she. They're not guilty either. And that the damnable thing is that as long as we keep thinking that they're guilty or that we're guilty, we don't get to the truth of the fact that they are there. They're not gratuitous because of our flaws or their flaws, but they're characteristic of the way in which experience actually happens because existence is that way. And that when we know that existence is that way, our whole burden of shame and guilt about experience can be put on the table and looked at later in a much more mature light. And that's what these angels bring. They bring the shh into existence so that there'll be a calmness in experience to be able to appreciate the mystery of life and not its tragedy. Because the first angel brings the cornucopia, the second angel brings here. Very, very, very interesting shape. There's a kind of object, which some people see as a sword and a scabbard, but actually is a wooden handle with a wooden disc around it. And it's the way scrolls used to be rolled. The form of books used to be on such scrolls, and you would hold the scrolls by this handle, and you would unroll them, and to keep the scrolls from wobbling, you would have then this little guard. And it looks exactly in imagery to a sword in a scabbard, unless one held up the whole scroll, and you would see that the other side has one also. So the quick and the clever saw angels holding swords coming down from heaven, whereas the patient and discerning saw that they were not holding swords in scabbards, but they were holding scrolls with handles, inviting man to learn that there's something he could hold and read. There's something he could hold and hear, and that there is an angel who brings a cornucopia in the first stage of the mysteries, and there's an angel who brings a book which can be heard and read in the second stage. And that this was the way the mysteries began. And it has nothing to do with Romans. That this archetype came into existence at least more than 2,000 years before Pompeii. That this imagery is so ancient, in fact, that it was ancient before there were cities. It goes back tens of thousands of years. It has nothing to do with Romans or Greeks or Egyptians or anybody else. It has to do with the way in which our species came into maturity at least 100,000 years ago, maybe more. That there is something here in the way in which, if we are present exactly at the entrance to a sacredness, and don't push it, and don't flee from it, but maintain our stillness right there on the threshold, we will hear something which seals us. And this allows us to continue in and on that process of mystery unfoldment as long as we remember what we have heard initially. Now this is extremely important. Nobel Prize winner Maria Gelman, writing about the way in which Maxwell's equation showed that if you take a very cold gas and a very hot gas and you put them in a container with a separation between them, so that the very cold gas always stays very cold and the very hot gas always stays very hot, the mathematics shows that somehow not every atom, not every molecule of the cold gas is equally cold. Some are colder than others. And that the coldness of the gas is an average of all these different molecules, all these different atoms. And the same is true of the very hot gas. Not all the atoms are equally hot. Some are a little hotter than others. And that even though you have them compartmentalized, if they're brought into that kind of polarity in mathematics, the very coldest of the hot gases will go over to the cold gas, and the very hottest of the cold gases will tend to go over into the hot gas, and this is called Maxwell's demon. And that this process could not be understood until the late 20th century. The first person to begin to really struggle with this problem was Leo Szilard, who began to answer that question in 1929 by introducing the relation between entropy and information. If you saw the film on the making of the first atomic bombs, little boy and Fat Man with Paul Newman and so forth. The Jewish intellectual in the bathtub who had his little tray because he could think really good in the bathtub. That was Leo Zeller at the University of Chicago. He was the brains behind realizing that from all the mathematics that an atomic bomb could be made because the application would be accurate. And he's the one who suggested that Oppenheimer was the kind of a man who could bring people together and hold them together. He was like, Szilard was the genius behind envisioning that this was not only something that was possible, but could be done. Because he had thought about these things all his life. Szilard began to answer that question back in 1929 by introducing the relation between entropy and information. Later, after the Second World War, Claude Shannon set forth clearly the mathematical notion of information, which was further clarified by the French theoretical physicist Léon Brillouin, and in the 1960s, the concept of algorithmic complexity. Don't get bogged down, just listen. Or algorithmic information content was introduced by Kolmogorov, Chaitin, and Solomonov. Finally, Rolf Landauer and Charlie Bennett of IBM worked out in detail how information and algorithmic information content are connected to the activity of a person, a daemon, or device that decreases the entropy of a physical system while increasing its own entropy by an equal or a greater amount. Bennett showed, this is at IBM in the 80s, IBM showed that a device acquiring the appropriate kind of information about a physical system and then recording it, say on paper or computer tape, can really use the recorded information to make heat flow from a cold object to a hot one as long as the device has blank paper or tape available. The entropy of the system composed of the hot and cold objects is thus decreased, but at the price of using up the paper or tape. As long as there is an openness in the universe, which is really there, this seeming loggerhead will be an equanimity. That's what the ancient mysteries said. When the initiate and the angels are really present together equally, in that silence, God speaks to man, and man is able to speak to God. Let's take a break. There, and then this top photo, come in on that. That's the fresco sequence. You can see on the left the woman just entering, you can see the naked boy reading, and you can see the priestess behind. Mm-hmm. Notice that the priestess doesn't have some kind of crescent moon and some weird hairdo, like a Star Trek Vulcan priestess. She looks like a mature woman. So let's come to another pair. There's something universal in pairedness. In the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu says that of all the things that can be said, pairedness is at the core of what is there. But what is there is not an ultimate, because beyond what is there is the Tao. But the Tao is not there. The Tao is here. The here-ness goes out of focus when we focus on the there-ness. The here-ness is still here, but we're focusing on the there-ness. It's the same thing as one's talking about form and background. The space in front of me is not visible, but as soon as I do this, my hand commands that space. And by making a symbolic form, the resonance of this symbolic form also includes the here-ness of the space around it. So that symbols are very powerful objectively, in that they also focus the invisible vibrations of the background and include it in the expressiveness. So that a symbol has more power than an action. The symbolic level is more powerful than the ritual level. Rituals come out of nature, symbols come out of language. Existence comes out of nature, mind comes out of language. Mind is objective. It's not a fantasy, it's not a fiction, it's not a what if. Mind is much more powerful than existence. Nowhere in that ecology, though, of nature, ritual, myth, symbol, nowhere in that ecology is there anyone who is, that we could call a person. That the person occurs in a totally different quality of energy from nature, ritual, myth, and symbol. Those four, that quaternary, that square, has to do with integration, whereas the person has to do with an energy mode known as differentiation. In order for me to become the person I am, I have to differentiate. And that process is completely different from integration, and we take a whole other year of our education to look at that process. That process includes vision, it includes art, it includes history, it includes science. It includes the objective realities of the person and the cosmos. But it's a different story. Or, to put it more accurately, it's a complement to the way in which integration happens. And that this is true not on a what-if suppositional metaphysical level, it's the way that form happens in this universe. So that in searching for a universal language of process, at the very same time, about 300 years ago, Leibniz in Germany and Newton in England both came to understand calculus in its integral and differential forms. And that one can master a language which speaks to both processes exactly right. One is the approach to the limitation of zero, the other is the approach to the limitation of one. And in between 1 and 0 is this double exchange process, which happens whether someone forces it to happen or not, whether one would like to have it happen or not, but only happens when there are conditions of equanimity someplace providing blank space, providing tape openness for an exchange process to happen. Otherwise, the laws of this universe condition us to settle closer and closer into a frozen polarity where there's no exchange whatsoever. And that's the only death there is. Part of the difficulty in ritual is what we're looking at now at this particular stage of the education. We're looking at two documents that were written about 80 years apart, 75 years apart. They both come from the same era of the world. One of them is one of the last recorded sermons of the historical person known as the Buddha, and the other is the last written great Greek classic tragedy by Euripides called the Bacchae or the Bacchae. The Bacchae was written about 404 BC, and the Satipatthana Sutra, the Mindfulness Sutra of the Buddha, was delivered somewhere about 80 years before. What's important is that these two documents for us, the Satipatthana Sutra of the Buddha and Euripides' tragedy, classic tragedy, the Bacchae, by using them together as a pair, we get an enormous advantage over Greeks who only knew Euripides, or Buddhists who only knew the Buddha. We get a tremendous advantage because we do not limit ourselves to the ritual knowledge which was there for them, but we pole vault into a symbolic capacity which is way beyond where they were. This is not to say that we are instantly superior to Buddhists or to classical Greeks, but that we're working on a level where the integration is much higher, much more powerful. You can do a lot more with that than by either of these by themselves. One of the best commentators, it's hard to say that, one of the best commentators on the Satipatthana Sutra was Nyaya Thera. Thera means an old monk. And in this little book published by the Word of the Buddha Publishing Committee, Colombo, Sri Lanka. Nice little hardcover book published in Ceylon, published in 1956. It was a second edition. It had come out a couple of years before, but they put it out in 1956 because in 1956 was what they called the Buddha Jayanti. It was the 2,500th year of the Buddha's enlightenment. 2,500 years. And to celebrate it, they did all kinds of things. And one of the things that the monks in Sri Lanka did is that they put this little book out because they consider the Mindfulness Sutra the fulcrum of the way in which people understand or do not understand the historical Buddha. Thera means an old, venerable one. And these are not like improved modern reform monks like the Mahayanas or like the Tibetan Vajrayanas or all of those. These are like the standard, basic, old craftsmen who still do things the old way. And they consider that this is the number one tool that one uses. If you're going to be a craftsman in meditation, then the Satipatthana Sutra is simply your saw, your hammer, whatever, the fundamental tool. Nyaya Thera writes this, just one little paragraph out of his whole book on this. Soberness, self-reliance, and observant, watchful attitude. Three things. Soberness, this is Sri Lanka in 1956. Soberness, self-reliance, observant, watchful attitude are the characteristics of this meditative practice. A true Satipatthana master will be very reticent in his relationship with those whom he instructs. He will avoid seeking to impress them by his personality. Why? Because the projection of a personality into this process, the personality is on such a much more powerful level, would distort the process by the introduction of personality at all. Because as symbols are much more powerful than ritual objects, the personality is that much more powerful than symbols. The personality is like a third order of objectivity. And the only thing more powerful than the personality is the cosmos as a whole, which is like a fourth level of objectivity. And you can imagine how powerful a personality is when it's about midway in between the universe as a whole and subjective reality and any symbol. So the person is enormously powerful. And its mere presence in a ritual situation completely changes the ritual situation, so that it would not be possible for anyone to see exactly what was there. They would see what was there in terms of that personality. So that the historical Buddha, who had a devastatingly powerful personality, always withdrew it when teaching the practical craft type qualities. And when he had his personality present, he didn't use language at all. And because it didn't happen very often, because usually people at that time, as now, need to have what we would call instruction. One of the few times that he taught without using language is remembered in the Zen tradition is the flower sermon, where he simply held up a flower. He just simply held up a flower. And only one person out of who knows how many hundreds, 500, 600, 700 people present, only one person smiled. The smile of that person was an objective correlative to the flower. And that's why the Buddha smiled and gave the flower to him. And that monk's name was Kashyapa. And after that he was known as Mahakashyapa. And Mahakashyapa, before he was Kashyapa, was the most powerful black magician in India. He's the one who had tried to put Siddhartha Gautama in his place, because he was running ramshod over a huge area of India along the Nanjara River, and everybody was afraid of him, and he had about 500 black magicians that he was training to go out and set up franchise black magical places all over India, and they were going to run the show. And they specialized in conjuring up fearful images. And Kashyapa, his specialty was really bad, really big snakes. And those really bad, really big snakes usually curled the toes and the psyches of anybody around. And so when he began teaching, the Buddha realized that he had to pull the plug on phony actions. And so when he, as they say, he didn't begin teaching, but when he put the Dharma chakra into motion, that's how they talk about it, used to, he pulled the plug on Kashyapa. Just like Shane, without a horse, he walked all the way down to where Kashyapa had his big magical university where he was training all these guys. And he walked into camp, and unarmed, seemingly, and he said he would like to spend the day looking around, and Kashyapa took it as a direct challenge, because in ancient India, the way of victory was that you had arguments. And whoever won the argument became the master, and the loser became the disciple. And so Kashyapa was able, because his arguments were not words, but his arguments are conjuring up these very big, very bad snakes. And so he invited the historical Buddha, he invited Siddhartha to spend the night. Have my hut, he said. It's especially a very powerful spot. In fact, it's the most powerful spot in the whole camp. In fact, sleep on my pallet. That's the very center. And so the Buddha went in and went to sleep on the pallet, and Kasyapa got busy, and he conjured up the very biggest, the very baddest snake that he possibly could. He used all the psychic energy to do that. But he didn't know that part of the Buddha's enlightenment process was being protected by the Naga king of the universe, who had wrapped his coil 7 times around the Buddha and then put his hood over his head to protect him from the inadvertent lightning that was coming from a huge thunderstorm at the time. And instead of circling him to strangle him, it was a protection. And so Mahakasyapa's psychic energy all went in this very big, very bad snake image. And the Buddha wrapped that objective correlative around himself and pulled the plug. And Kasyapa discovered that his dragon power flamed out. That he couldn't conjure any more serpents, even little worms, anymore. And he wondered who had done this. And on his way out, the Buddha gave him a very special gesture, which is time-honored. He was the only one who heard the flower sermon of the Buddha. And the Buddha said, "This flower is for you." And so in place of the flamed out, very big, very bad snakes, Kasyapa got a flower. And that's why the lotus is the symbol of enlightenment and not the snake in India. Don't tell anyone, especially not the Buddhists. So, Nyapanikatera, on the Buddha Jayanta, the 2500th anniversary of his enlightenment, said, soberness, self-reliance, and an observant, watchful attitude are characteristics of this meditative practice. A true Satipatthana master will be very reticent in his relationship with those whom he instructs. He will avoid seeking to impress them by his personality and thus making them followers. He will not have recourse to any external or mental devices that are likely to induce self-hypnotism, trance, or mere emotional exaltation. It's on page 66 of this little book. Correlating to these three are 3 characteristics of existence: impermanence, suffering, impersonality. On the ritual level, purely on the ritual level, we're not talking about persons, not talking about vision, we're not talking about the cosmos, we're not talking about even symbols, we're not talking about myth or language, we're not talking about experience. On pure existence level, it is hounded by 3 characteristics that are actually there on that level: impermanence, suffering, impersonality. And it's only by seeing that that's what it is that one is then free to look elsewhere and find personality and find permanence and find the cure from suffering, because they are elsewhere, they're not there. And they are elsewhere because they are not there. If they were not there in existence, they wouldn't be elsewhere somewhere else. And so the whole knack about wisdom is to understand that the good news follows the bad news, but that you have to see the bad news first. As Bertrand Russell recorded in the 3rd volume of his autobiography, he said, you have to see that this world is as shameful, dirty, rotten, ruined as you ever expected, And only then can you go to work and make things better and then really live a good life. Why is that so? Because existence is an objective correlative in ritual of something that is real on the symbolic level. What is it that is real on the symbolic level? Realization is the general word that is given to it. The classic word used in the Buddhist time was insight. The word that was used is prajna. Prajna. Insight. But insight occurs, prajna occurs on the symbol level, on level of symbols. It's objective. It's an objective thing. Insight is objectively real on symbol level. But on ritual level, it's not there. Or rather, it's there in a nascent way, which one would never know that grows up to be insight. One would not suspect. What is there on the ritual level? The ancient Indian word for it was dana, dana. And it literally translates into English as giving. And to objectify it, we call it givingness, or we call it charity. Charity, true, actual, real charity, matures into insight. This is why in the wisdom of Maimonides, the highest charity is that no one knows who gave and no one knows who received. The only thing that we know was that giving happened. That's all we know on that level. That givingness that actually occurs with no one knowing who gave and no one knowing who received makes that givingness objectively real, so that the prajna insight later on in the mind is equally real. And that soul that realizes that is real. As they used to say, realer than rocks. Dionysus, who's the great mythological protagonist of Euripides' Bacchae. Dionysus, in Greek mythological ethos, was the god of existence. Not Apollo, not Zeus. Dionysus was the god of existence. But the story doesn't stop there. Because there is another aspect, because Dionysus is paired. I think the phrase in Hollywood is, what the hell? Well, who is Dionysus paired to? And the answer is Prometheus. Because Prometheus, in Greek mythological ethos, was the hero of existence. Dionysus is the image of existence, but Prometheus is the symbol of existence. And they go together. And when they go together, realization happens. Now, this was not something that everybody knew. Almost nobody ever knew this. But it is profound on same level as Buddha's Satipatthana Sutra. This is extremely interesting. This pair Dionysus troubles man. Prometheus troubles God. Which God? Zeus especially, he troubles him. That's why he's bound. That's why he's chained. He's chained to the top of the mountain with an eagle eating his liver forever. Why? Because he knows something which Zeus does not like. He knows that if he gives man this little special something, that eventually man will outgrow Zeus. That's called holy shit. That's what that phrase is. I don't know what the ancient Greek for it was, but they said the same thing at that time. And that's what Zeus said. Olympus echoed with it. I think at first he might have just said, you better turn that over to me. And of course Prometheus was not the kind of guy. He said, in his best John Wayne voice, not likely, Pilgrim. Or something like that. What was he carrying? He was carrying in a fennel stalk the spark of the insight. Because all insight needs is one particle of light, one molecule of light, one photon is all that man needs. But he needs to be able to get simple enough to see one photon. Just like the initiate woman, if she takes only one step and one step only, and pauses there, and hears exactly what is sealing at that moment, she can remember that she took that one step, and the articulation of that one step will articulate all the rest of the process through to completion. Why this is so is a mystery. That it is so is incontrovertible, because you can do it yourself. The invitation is, you don't believe this, you do it yourself. And then you come back when you finish, and you try and argue the other way. The very beginning, though, the very first step is to take one step only, to see one photon only. And that takes an incredible simplicity. In fact, it's called, in the Satipatthana Sutra, insight is called prajna, but it is completely linked up with another word. Prajna is linked up with jhana, J-H-A-N-A, jhana. And jhana means absorption. Absorption in the sense of something which sponges up spills completely. Like a black hole which sponges up energy completely. A black hole which sponges up energy completely, but except for the most mysterious thing possible on the threshold of the black hole's sponge, something called Hawking radiation, because Stephen Hawking was the first to mathematically understand that it was there and predicted it, and it was found, and it actually occurs, is that paired molecules of light appear on the surface, on the threshold horizon of a black hole. Where they come from is a complete mystery. It's as much of a mystery now as it ever was. But paired reality comes into existence on the hot side from the cold side, because the cold side is averagely cold and not really cold. Not all of a black hole's black holeness is as black. Now that sounds like Chicago hype. You is not as black as me. But that's what the mathematics show, and that's what the astrophysics shows, that Hawking radiation indeed exists. And in powerful meditation, when one vanishes completely, your mind, completely, nada, tilde, zip, the very next instant, you're back. And that you're back is totally unprecedented, mysterious. And the only thing you can do is find someone else who's done that and say, did you see that? Yeah. Well, what was it? Well, I don't know. And there are conversations like that all through history. There is no doubt that you were gone. The Buddha never called himself a Buddha. He called himself Tathagata, one whose suchness was gone. And you ask him, well, are you here teaching? Yes. Oh yeah. One's suchness was completely gone, and yet today you're here teaching. In fact, for 45 years you're teaching. Now that's either a complete impossible conundrum, or there's some kind of secret process of exchange going on, which is a complete mystery, which is characteristic of reality. And that not all deaths are dead. Some are more dead than others. And if you don't get as dead as you can dead be, death comes back into life. Not because anybody wants it to, or wills it to, or hopes it will, but that it does. And it's mysterious. So that in our ritual education at this particular time, what we're interested in, and we're really interested, we're interested in looking at the Satipatthana Sutra and Euripides Bacchae one more week, next week. We're going to just look one more week, and then we're going to make a shift from this pair to another pair. We're using books because of the easiest level on which to play. The next pair will be a pair of Zen books from Japan, because the Japanese are now like the Japanese have always been. They can't let something alone until they simplify it and polish it to the nth degree and say, well, that's as simple as you can get it. And so the Japanese took this and polished it to its ultimate simplicity. And we're going to take Basho and Zeami, Zen poetry and Zen drama. And we're going to hold as a kind of a comparative context for us, Yeats. Because Yeats dealt with poetry and drama equally. He was a genius equally. He's as great a dramatist as he was a poet. Because all of Yeats's drama are based upon Japanese no plays, and Zeami was the ultimate master of Zen drama, N-O-H, no drama. And Basho was the ultimate Japanese poet. But we're not going to take just the poetry, because Basho was the originator of the haiku form. Haiku poetry. Single instant, one photon only, please. One step only. But we're going to take his Okuno Hosamichi, his narrow road to the deep north, which is a Zen travelogue, which is about taking a journey. He says that he's feeling old and he's watching the drifting clouds all day. He realizes that he's come to the end of his life and he'd like to die on the road rather than just sitting in his little grass hut with the broken bamboo plants. He named himself Basho because in Japanese, Basho is the bamboo plant. It shreds, it frays, but it does not break. You can tatter it, you can fray it, but it does not frazzle. It's still there. So he called himself Basho. And he wanted to die on the road, so he wrote a travelogue. And he took a journey to the deep north of Japan. not Hokkaido, but Honshu Island. And he went with a friend of his, a young friend named Sora. And while they went, whenever he got to an articulation that was infinitely important to him, he stopped writing prose, and at that space he left a gap and he put a haiku in there. So he used haiku as the presencing joints for a prose journey. And the prose journey was the ultimately simple Japanese initiation of the mystery pattern, moving from life into death, so that life would come back out of death again. And that's what Basho did. And we're going to take a Japanese no play by Zeami about a woman who is exactly at that mysterious juncture between life and death, and whose image in a well, because she had looked in the well, is still impressed on the water of the well, and her capacity to reach her love comes through the vibrational quality of the image left in the well. And all you see on the stage is the well with its little dipper on a stone circle around it. And all of the drama happens vis-a-vis one character only on that stage, and the ring within which is the well, within which is the vibrational remembrance of the image. And because the image was sealed by the language of love, the image is still real, and the meeting is still real, and the love still holds and is real. So we're going to move from Buddha and the Euripides not to any second-rate stuff, but to really first-rate stuff. But both of them, Japanese, Basho and Zeami, keeping in mind Yeats, because we need a little comparison here because we're not Japanese. But notice here that this is the same kind of process that we've been doing all along. We've been doing this for a long time. And the process is in this kind of fashion. In order to make our education a series of beads, well, let's not even use the term beads, let's call them pearls, because that's what traditionally we're called. Each actual learning episode was a pearl. And in order to string the pearls together in the right way, we have to tie the string which unites the pearls into a knot each time in between. Not a knot making complication, but a knot that makes articulation. For those who can hear it, a knot is a one-dimensional self-avoiding pattern in a three-dimensional space which cannot receive it. Well, there's a whole theory on knot theories in modern mathematics. Modern meaning the 1990s. Before that, very few people could even think about this. The first person to think about this accurately was Johnny van Neumann, the great games theorist in the 1950s. We're stringing with an ongoing sense which knots itself periodically in order to allow pearls of episodes to keep together in a string, so that our education ends up with a pearl necklace and not with an indistinct something which we cannot recover or use at all. If you want it all at once, there are ways to get it all at once, be my guest. It's like staring at the sun with the naked eye. You see the sun, but you'll never see anything else again. The physical eye will be blind. Be my guest. But this process makes a pearl necklace. And you can hold that pearl necklace in any way that you want, your mind, your hand, or anything. And you can live any kind of life you want and have it with you. That's what this education is. The pearls are made by pairing books together in sequences that have a kind of a methodical wave form pattern. We use 3 pairs, and then we punctuate it by a single book. The single book is the knot. The 3 pairs make eventually a pearl. Why would 3 times 2 make some kind of memorable episode so that you could say this is a pearl of learning? It's actually so that you pair, if you pair a pair, if you take 2 pairs, a pair of pairs makes a square. Esoterically, a square is a pair of pairs. If you bring in a 3rd pair, it makes a cube. And once you have a cube rather than a square, you have moved from geometry to trigonometry. And once you get to trigonometric functions, you're one insight away from being able to understand the calculus of integration and differentiation. No one can give you that learning, but a really good teacher can bring you to the threshold where you can see that if you take one more step from here, you will have it yourself. So that the important thing for a teacher who can do this is to make sure that at the right juncture, he or she stands aside and lets you by. Because the whole purpose is to bring you to the point to where you take that step for yourself. We use 3 pairs of books. Like in ritual, we started with Black Elk's Sacred Pipe, and paired with it was Fraser's Golden Bough. We started with American Indian Anthropological Classic and used them as a pair. Now we're using the Bacchae and the Satipatthana Sutra of the Buddha, and next the 3rd pair will be Basho and Zenami, haiku and no drama. Those 3 pairs will make a cube of ritual for us, so that ritual will be understood as ritual. And then in order to tie ritual off so that it is distinct and not mixed with myth at all, because the next thing we're going to take a look at is myth. And when we get to myth, the first pair of books is going to be Inanna, the ancient Sumeria myth of the descent of the goddess and her 7 stages, and Plato's Phaedrus, the dialogue about the mysteries of the way in which myth works. But before we get to Inanna and Plato, that pair, we have to tie the cube of the 3 pairs of ritual off. And the book that we're going to use is the Mundaka Upanishad. Mundaka, the root of that, mund in Sanskrit means razor, like in shave. The Mundaka Upanishad is about shaving away what is not needed and leaving left only what is needed. And the Mundaka Upanishad, one comes to see that the last thing that you have when you shave away is the razor itself, is the edge of the razor itself. And if you see that you have left only one sharp line that differentiates, that's a real insight. Just like when we did nature, we had 3 pairs of books. We had to start somewhere, and so we started with simply ourselves, wherever we lived. We took a walk and came back home. And so one of the books that we used was Thoreau, his little essay on walking, because that's what we were doing. But we paired with Thoreau the I Ching, because the I Ching is one of the few works, one of the few books that actually simply takes a look at the actual process of everything together as a single unity. The Book of Changes. It doesn't assume that there's any objectivity anywhere at all. Nothing in the I Ching assumes objectivity. It's an ocean of change, and the only thing that one could say is it's just one ocean. So we paired the I Ching and Thoreau together as our initial pair, and then the problem was to find a second pair that would meet that and make a square so that one would have a plane of reference. Time out. 1 week, and then we'll come back to the plane of reference. I'm not going to go away.